We're so honored. Okay, I told you that you guys, I don't do this normally, but we have a really talented artist in the building by the name of Sergio. Ah, I can't not say hello to this king right here because he's in the building, and I may even need to be reaching out to him to get him on the show if he will ever allow me or ever let me. Anyways, thank you guys for tuning back into the Sedelia and Jai show. I am your host, Sedelia and Jai. We are back with part two. Sorry that we had to cut out, but IG only allows us to be online for about an hour. And we're here with our special guest, RK Jackson, who is a branding and marketing designer, as well as a history and, dare I say, politics enthusiast. Again, one of the most knowledgeable people that I know, and we're going to bring him in right away so that we can continue this conversation. Of He already spoke to us about one of the historic districts in Atlanta, that is Sweet Auburn, and he was beginning to tell us about another historic district by the name of the West End. For those of you who do not know geographics in Atlanta, these are again historic districts, prominent districts that were heavily influenced by African American culture and African American legacy. And we're so honored to have him on here with us this evening. Hi, RK. Thanks for joining us.
I'm back.
Hope we didn't take too long to get back on here. All right, we back. We're back
Okay.
to the business. You were telling us, sheesh, you were.
It was a lot, yeah.
It was a lot, but it's a good. I like a lot. A lot is good. You briefly spoke to us about the history of the Sweet Auburn district and kind of the role that systemic racism has played in that history. And you were getting ready to delve into another district that's really popular by the name of the West End. So let's pick up from there.
Okay. So to start off, the West End, ironically enough, is actually historically white. And it's actually about a decade or so older than Atlanta itself, right? It was,
Wow.
yeah, it was,
Wow.
yeah. Believe it or
Look at me.
not,
I'm like, I was going there to shop, to
yeah.
get my hair done, to get my nails done, to get my Taco Bell.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at
Apple's
it now,
Alex
you would
Knife.
just, yeah, you would never know. Like, if you looked at it now, you'd be like, okay,
Absolutely not. It's it's
yeah.
it's not a bad area, guys, but at least when I left, it was a little bit run down.
Yeah, and that's for a reason. Specifically, the reason uh, that was a direct correlation to what happened in the 70s, right? So when a lot of these white people started to leave, between the 30s and the 60s, and then the 70s just kind of tipped everything off because black people now, integration was a thing, segregation was now illegal. There were actual fair housing practices at the time where people could actually leave the area and go look for bigger homes and different opportunities in the metro Atlanta area, which is like oh god, as far as population density goes, it's like 1 to 5, right? So 5 being metro Atlanta, 1 being Atlanta. Atlanta itself only has about 550,000 residents, while the metro Atlanta area is half the population of Georgia, which is about 6 million people. And so when people talk about Atlanta, they're normally talking about the metro Atlanta area and not really the Atlanta area.
Right.
And so a lot of, I think, comments and stuff kind of get misplaced, but that is for a reason. And we'll probably get into that as well too. But the West End is extremely old. Probably I want to say 1820s. And it was probably predominantly white until like the 1940s and 50s. And that was around the time that the Housing Act came around. And the Housing Act basically allowed developers and contractors to basically get subsidized loans for homes that they could turn around and sell to white people, literally with the contention that they did not sell to black people. And so they were legitimately creating suburbs across the country, honestly, because this was a federal program, and kind of suburbanizing the Atlanta area, but then the Atlanta metro Atlanta area, basically, creating like Clayton County, which is not predominantly white anymore. DeKalb, which is predominantly black, and a couple of the different counties as well too. A lot of people kind of fled to Forsyth and Coweta County and stuff like that as well too. Um, but the West End basically was abandoned. A lot of people who lived in the West End were working class people. They worked in the railroad industry. They were textile, metal workers. There's actually a area in, and you know this well, an area in a south downtown area called Pittsburgh and Mechanicsville.
Mm-hmm.
And those two places legitimately were working class areas. They were homes were little shotgun homes, all built next to each other, literally just to house the workers in that area that were working on the steel and the railroad industry as well. And so the West End quickly became, I want to say by, oh God, 1980s, probably like 80% black at that time. When I say white flight, and I guess we'll get into that and gentrification as well too. But when I say white flight, that it was quick.
I want to stop you right there just for a minute to talk about this term white flight for viewers who don't know it. I can tell them, but they don't trust me, honey. I can tell them. I said, I've been trying to tell y'all. Y'all don't want to hear it from me. So I bring on specialists like yourself to talk to us about that. What is white flight? And then get back into what you were saying.
Yeah, I kind of touched on it a little bit briefly in a couple different answers, but I guess to sum it all up,
Yeah.
uh, there were two specific um, federal housing acts that happened. There was um, well, there was the Federal Housing Act and there was the Highway Act. The Housing Act is what I was talking about in the previous answer, basically, which gave federal funds to basically white people, upperly mobile, working white people, essentially the white middle class in Atlanta at the time, gave them incentives to leave into the suburbs as those places were getting built out with effectively dirt cheap, land and homes, right?
Right.
So the developers that decided to build brand new communities were incentivized by a lot of state and local government at the time, because this was still during segregation, to basically keep these communities white. And so a lot of the times now when you look back on it, when people say, oh, this is a nice neighborhood, or this is, oh, I love that neighborhood over there, or, whatever the case may be, it's normally just a dog whistle to a predominantly or historically white area that was created for white people. A lot of these people would eventually turn around and do the same thing again in the late 60s, because they didn't like the tax rate in Atlanta. And so they literally created their own counties in North Atlanta to effectively have their own, police structures, police, systems, their own banks, and effectively create their own communities. Johns Creek is one of those that is probably one of the more recent ones. It's extremely far north, and extremely so. Back to the West End.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So the '80s was a really really big time for '80s and yeah, the '80s were a really big time for the West End, especially according to my dad. Again, he's old. My grandmother as well too. She's had her home on First Street, right off of Westview Drive, since I want to say, oh God, probably '39. And so that home has
Wow.
been, yeah, that home has been there probably since the early '30s, late '20s, early '30s. Those are one of the first homes built for um, working class white people, in the city at the time, because they would just live just directly away from the train or just directly away from a factory. A lot of Castleberry Hill still has a lot of the mattress factories and pencil factories. My grandmother worked for Scripto, which was a company that made pens and lighters. and I want to say some other like weird plasticware or whatever. And then she would end up going to Sears Roebuck after Scripto kind of well they're still around I think actually, but there was more opportunity, you know, because a lot of larger warehouses and manufacturers were coming to the city, and so a lot of these Black people started to move to um, you know, the West End, basically to have homes and being able to commute back and forth into not that far away from, you know, these homes and being away from their communities. Um, it got really, really popping really quickly. You know, the AUC is the oldest thing over there, but literally
Yes.
community was built around it, you know, and um, that kind of goes back to another answer that we talked about earlier, but
Right.
you could obviously see when things started to change, and there was a sense of a depravity in between the two. You got these, you know, effectively upperly mobile college students in the area who were learning and you know, educating themselves and getting these expensive degrees, and you know, basically going out of the community again at that time to live, work, play, you know, whatever the case may be. But then you've got this um, community that was basically built around in that area, who were still working class, poor, Black people, you know, Black families, multi-family homes. And so um, once the AUC
And
started to
let's talk about
change,
the drastic difference between those communities, right? You're because again, you know, Black people at this college, they're more or less a little bit affluent if they're able to afford
right,
college, right?
right, and that's the theme, I guess, throughout a lot of the beginning of what we've been talking about is
Right.
I believe that we, in our quest for knowledge and enlightenment and success, right, upward mobility, uh, participating in capitalism, you know, we
Right.
tend to, and we have tended to historically, when given the opportunity to leave the poorest of us, the least educated of us, the least, you know, available to opportunities for us in these same communities. You know, you can look out the window at a dorm and see these people, you know, doing it day by day, you know, making it happen, whether it is on the street or if it's on, you know, at a job, right? You know, you know, going back and forth between MARTA bus stations or catching the train or something like that. You know what I mean? And so you get this weird clash when you have an influx of, you know, affluent and, you know, educated Black people, young Black people specifically, in a community with younger Black people as well who don't have those same exact opportunities. You know what I mean? And that's prevalent a lot. Well, it was prevalent a lot in kind of the earlier days of Atlanta. Everybody kind of was like side by side in the community, but then, of course, after the '70s, everybody kind of dipped out. The Highway Act in the '50s is what actually kind of put the nail in the coffin for the West End. That split up Sweet Auburn Avenue. It also split up um, the West End. Like when you go to the West End now, you literally just see a highway, you know, directly down the center.
Right. Yeah, that
Um,
was crazy to me when you see that, like how it's divided like that.
yeah, and
It's
that
almost
literally
like
was
it's
just
almost indicative of the disruption.
well, it was violence. That is literal violence. When you can, you know, have a or a transportation project that takes a decade to complete. There is literally no investment in that area. You know, no. If you can imagine, that area is again older than Atlanta itself. You're not changing pipes. You know what I mean? You're
Right.
not, you know, fixing infrastructure and potholes in the street. You're not. Um, Reinforcing a lot of these, you know, historic buildings and stuff like that. And so while a lot of those places still stand, thankfully, you know, you miss out on a lot of community and investment in those spaces because um, the quest, I guess, for capitalism leaves a lot of people behind on the train, if you will. And so I think I want to say gosh, after there was a huge um, subprime mortgage, predatory lending scheme that happened in the 90s. And it hit the West End the hardest, I think, out of all of Atlanta. The next crisis like that probably wouldn't be until the early 2000s that kind of affected, the rest of the country. But it was a really, really bad time for people in Atlanta. And I remember specifically because I was a, a coherent at that time in the early 90s. And on into the late 90s, obviously. But my grandmother on First Street had her best friend lived next door to her. I forgot her name. I think it was, it doesn't matter. And they basically were trying to seize that street, with eminent domain. And enough petitions were signed. Thankfully, enough Black leadership at that time really helped keep the West End and the West Side for the most part, intact. But I'll never forget my grandmother's best friend actually was like, yeah, I'll take the money. Y'all can have this house. You know what I mean? So, at that time, they were trying to move a lot of Atlanta's older residents out in the West End. So that's Vine City, English Avenue, Swats. So moving those people out into assisted living facilities and kind of like changing that generation in that area to pave way for new spaces for economic renewal. And so you weren't getting a lot of older Black people at that time willing to sell their homes. You weren't really getting a lot of older Black people dying, honestly, fast enough for the city and local government to be able to take all these places. But then Black leadership, honestly, in that time really helped keep that place alive because Martin Luther King Jr. had a home in the West Side outside of his birth home on Sweet Auburn Avenue. There's, I want to say, two really big historic high schools on the West Side as well too,
Right.
that were basically preserved by like Gladys Knight, and I want to say even our current mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms went to school on the West Side as well too. So there's a lot of community that helped save the community, if you will. And save is a rough word as well too because there were a lot of casualties, but for the most part, the West End really did not survive the highway project, and they didn't really survive
Huh.
the mortgage crisis in the 90s, and then there was another mortgage crisis in the early 2000s that really just, the West End for the most part at this point is really kind of a ghost town with a rising white population, which is ironic. And I want to say the last thing I heard recently was, while they have a lot of places have been preserved historically, they're trying to build a new kind of mixed use facility where West End Mall
They're
currently
trying to
stands.
build a new what? I'm so sorry. I
Oh
missed
yeah, a new mixed use facility
Okay.
where the West End Mall currently stands, and it'll be like a much larger mall. It'll be mini shops. It'll be
Yeah,
affordable
I was looking
housing.
at I saw something on the news about a reconstruction plan for the West End Mall, and I was like, oh, more historic West End. Do you think it's
Yeah,
a good or
yeah.
a bad change?
Um, it's difficult because then it goes back into my issue with the idea of the Black Mecca, or my pause and the idea of it, because while there have been a lot of changes since a lot of West Side renewal projects have happened since the vote and the construction of the new Mercedes-Benz Stadium off of Northside Drive. Um, there's been a rough relationship for a long time. I'd say probably about the last 25 to 30 years of, you know, um, divestment in that area. People not really feeling like they've been being heard as far as um, just support and infrastructure in those spaces. But then also with no investment in those areas as well too, you get lowering housing prices. When you get lowering housing prices, those directly are correlated to the larger kind of scheme of wealth and wealth inequality in the city as well too. And what we know from increased poverty rates, you automatically see increased crime as well too, because crime is a function of proximity. So it's difficult because you want to go up for all of Atlanta. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I find that
You
a lot
want
of people,
improvement, but you don't want it to be at the expense of.
right. And I think that a lot of people really go hard for the things that they can control and the things that find them entertainment, the things that, give them education, the things that are fun to do. Lennox Mall, we can celebrate the positives a lot of the time, I think, of Atlanta, but there's such a much larger systemic and structural issue that I feel like is being slowly addressed, but has missed a lot of attention in the last, 3 decades. And so that's really my biggest thing with that is all those things are kind of intrinsically tied to, I feel we've put profit over people a lot of the time.
I see that. So I wanna just jump into it and talk a little bit about because I think this can be an extension of that. One of the largest issues in this Black Lives Matters movement is a lot of people understanding a term that I keep hearing all the time, which is generational wealth.
Yeah.
I keep hearing it. I'm like, generational wealth, generational wealth, generational wealth. I'm like, what does that really mean? What are you saying by that? I understand what it means, obviously, and what they're saying, but I'm saying this to say that if it's something that should be had amongst the Black community, amongst our many accomplishments, because we have still come a long way, and that's what I want people to realize: gratefulness. We've come a long way. We still have more to go, and I don't know how long this is gonna go on, but it's going on because this world wasn't built for us. It was built on, things have evolved, but things are the way that they are because this system of oppression works.
Right.
Let's be very honest.
Absolutely.
So when I hear people talk about we need generational wealth, I remember watching not a because I won't say the Oprah special. I wish I remembered her name. Oh, Lord forgive me. Oh my God, this is not cool. But yeah, I'll remember her name. But on that same special that we had Ava DuVernay on there, and Keisha Lance Bottoms was equally on this special. There was another woman who I believe was she an author, but she spoke about. She said, we Black people can never have generational wealth.
Mm-hmm.
We can't have it. We're always going to be behind just because we're always going to be playing this game of catch up.
Yeah.
Because of how things have been, how they are, and the opportunities that are available. And she gave some statistics that shocked me. I was like, what? Like, because this whole time I was like, yeah, we need generational wealth. Oh, I just marry a Black man, have Black babies, and we both have great careers, and then we pass that down to our Black children. And then I was like, oh wait, my parents did that.
Yeah.
Are we wealthy? Are we exercising generational wealth? Not yes and no. It has to start. It's deeper than that. So I want to ask you, because I'm not a specialist. I don't know.
I'm not a specialist either.
We're not specialists, but we're gonna figure it out together.
For sure.
But you do have some theories, more so than I do, on why it's so hard for Black people to acquire generational wealth. And I think a part of that I realized when you were telling me about literally, like when you were talking to me about real estate in these historic areas.
Yeah. So that's really the biggest linchpin in the history of Atlanta has been the fact that a lot of these, historic communities and places that you hear about, like Tulsa, like Rosewood, like Charlotte in North Carolina, Durham in North Carolina, all these Black Wall Streets, if you will, all were basically destroyed and ripped apart by a numerous amount of things. And I joke about this, or more of a tongue-in-cheek thing, to people who ask about it. Um, uh, Somebody's always like, why can't people just put them up by their bootstraps? You know what I mean? Like, what happened? Like, why can't you do that? And it's like, every single time we've tried to create our own spaces and communities and buildings and homes and then try to govern
Communities,
them.
they shut it down, burn it to
Yeah,
the ground,
burn it
shut
to
it
the
down.
ground. Atlanta's first black millionaire, Alonzo Herndon, they burned his barbershop down twice, and he had one of the largest ones in the world at the time. Um, it really has just been a consistent.
And so that's the part, right? They burn it and they
Mhm.
shut it down. And then in our history, you and I are here today, like, why isn't anyone making change? Why have black
Yeah,
people been suffering? Why are we,
yeah.
you know?
But then you think about it too, like you get legal discrimination, Jim Crow laws. A lot of these places where we were creating communities out of necessity and depravity, essentially, we were just kind of taking what we got and tried to thrive with it. One of the worst stories I remember is, I want to say it was in 1906 right before the race riots in Atlanta,
Okay.
before they burned down most of Black Atlanta businesses at the time. Hoke Smith, who was a gubernatorial candidate for governor at the time, said something like, basically, not allowing Black people effectively to not believe in themselves keeps our power over them effectively. And so we need to continuously, and this is like 15 years, 14 years before the Klan resurfaces in Atlanta as well too, on their second wave after the Civil War. There was literally a political campaign around the fear of the Black elite, the fear of the Black wealthy, the fear of the Black affluent. And it got so bad that John Wesley Dowds, who I was telling you about before, who was the grandfather of Maynard Jackson, the first Black mayor of Atlanta, he had to basically petition with the then mayor of Atlanta to try to get streetlights for Sweet Auburn Avenue and try to get holes repaired in the streets. But then they also felt like they weren't being represented enough in police. So John Wesley Dobbs actually helped get the first Black police officers in Atlanta. And so all these spaces where we try to get representation and quote unquote get that seat at the table, we have either been, like I was saying, literally when you can't be outwardly and overtly racist anymore, racism has to kind of get creative. You know what I mean? And so that's where you get, not allowing Black people to be able to vote unless they have land. That's how you get, not allowing Black people to vote in districts unless they were kind of drawn in them. And that's the whole history behind redlining, is like drawing all the Black people into one corner, letting them govern their slum, and then, you know what I mean, take all the economic investment somewhere else in the city. And so that's kind of what began that issue and disparity with generational wealth. It was that, like, as soon as we got something, either it was destroyed by mob violence, destroyed by predatory governmental practices. It was destroyed by urban renewal. But then think about it like this: you've got, the biggest way to grow generational wealth, amongst families. The biggest thing that's passed down is homes. And so imagine you've now taken all the investment out of these areas, the Westons, the Sweet Auburn area, Castleberry Hill, all these different places that were, really heavily Black at the time. You don't put any money there. You allow the infrastructure to go to shit. Don't allow for renewal permits to help fix these buildings and things of that nature. And so now your property values go down. So now you spent all this time trying to fight off racism. Now what you've got, if you've got anything at all, because you're hopefully still alive at this point, you know what I mean?
Right,
Um,
right.
you
That's
know,
what's, oh,
yeah, and hopefully still alive at this point. Now your, $30,000 investment probably at the time is worth about $10,000. So now you owe on it. And so you've now gotten people into a space where not only are they not gaining wealth, they're actually owing more money every single time something like this happens across the country. And so that was like one of the biggest things, because in the Housing Act of 37, 39, I believe it was, created the first, and believe it or not, created the first housing project in the country, and it was in Atlanta. It's called Tekla Homes. Housing projects were not designed for poor Black people. They were designed for working class white people. And it was basically, there were so many more white people getting back into the workforce after the war, and after the Great Depression. They wanted more people into the city so they didn't have to commute, because there wasn't infrastructure for a lot of cars. A lot of these cities did not have streetcars. Ironically enough, the West End did, believe it or not. And so they wanted more white people that were working in the city, in these factories. They wanted to sun up, sundown. You've seen the movies where they're, they clock in, they leave the factory, they go home to their family, kiss their wife, go to bed, wake up, do it again. That was what housing projects were created for, basically. After the Housing Act of in the 50s, I believe it was, which is what basically kind of was the end of a lot of that, coupled with the end of segregation, incentivized, like I was saying earlier, about a lot of these developers and stuff trying to suburbanize these urban areas now, where they're basically giving away houses dirt cheap to white people specifically. And then a lot of these things, coupled with like, Jim Crow laws that were finally, over in the late 30s and 40s, a lot of that stuff kind of trickled down. You still had a lot of overt and inadvertent racism that happened, and discrimination that happened, where a lot of people were, not allowed to renew leases on buildings that they had in the city. They weren't allowed to move out into these white neighborhoods and stuff like that. So you now take, 40 years basically of equity that these white people have been able to create with their homes out in these suburban areas or whatever. And now they can do whatever they want with it. You know what I mean?
Right.
I was reading, ironically enough, I was reading the census from 39, which is around the time that all these housing acts and federal highway acts and stuff like that were created and implemented, and right in the heart of Jim Crow South as well too. The wage disparity, not even just accrued wealth and inherited wealth, because there wasn't any for Black people at the time. The wage disparity was absolutely ridiculous. I think it was white men were making like 140% more than Black men. Black men only made...
You said 100 and what?
140%.
Don't stress me out.
Yeah. So in 1939, white men were making literally 140% more than Black men. I want to say that Black men made $200 less than white women, and Black women made half that.
Black women we ain't never been loved. Don't get me started. Don't.
And mind you, during this time period too.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you right now. Don't do that to me. Don't get me started.
It's a rough history.
Wrap that up, because I'm gonna get upset.
Yeah, it's a inconvenient truth. Like, and back then, non-white people were still 95% Black.
Yeah.
And so, you didn't have this very large minority, people of color community in Atlanta. It was Black and it was white Atlanta.
Right.
And so I think that wage gap for men only dropped to about maybe 67 to 70% 40 years later. So again, imagine, right? At the same rate that white men are getting subsidies to live in the suburbs, or white families specifically. And keep in mind, during this time, this is after the Great Depression, only white men effectively during this time period were allowed to take out home loans, take out credit loans, buy cars. Women weren't allowed to drive. Like, women weren't allowed to have credit cards, take out loans themselves, have credit. Keep in mind all that, right? This was right before the Equal Rights Amendment movement. to try to, well, it was on both sides. It was trying to keep women in the home, but then also allowing women to work and have autonomy over their bodies and stuff like that. Systemic racism goes into patriarchy and misogyny. It's all,
Right. We digress.
it's
Yeah.
baked into the mac and cheese there, but you take that 40 years kind of head start that the government basically gave white families to create wealth, basically. By the time Black people were actually given the opportunity, in the 70s to live outside of Atlanta, they took it, they flew, but imagine they're leaving behind debt, because all their businesses for the most part were either just surviving or just making it in these predominantly Black areas that have now been devoid of investment. Um, they are upward mobile, as in, they're teachers, they are professors at the AUC, they are doctors, lawyers. They can literally afford to leave the city or whatever. But now you literally create these environments in these communities. I want to say like in the late 50s, late 50s, during the Housing Act, basically they left these communities. The government basically subsidizing housing in the suburbs, trying to suburbanize America, coupled with housing at the end of segregation at that time, basically left a lot of these communities bare and empty. So imagine you got a city, oh God, of only like 500,000 people, and you lose 150,000 white people basically overnight, and then maybe 20 years later, you lose an additional, 100,000 Black people or 75,000 Black people or so. You're in whole streets that only have one person or two people that live there. You know what I mean? And no one is going to start some crazy marketing campaign about why you should live in the West End when there's 3 people on the street. You're going to think it's full of crime. You're going to think it is, a slum. And a lot of the times
So
they
the
used,
value is lowered.
and the value was lower. And it was lower because people were leaving by force or by choice, And the government at that time, at literally after, I want to say it was like a 30-year campaign, basically, of moving people out of, these cities, ended up spending something of, I don't know, it was like a 50 billion in modern day dollars, right, on creating this new, normal, right? You're decimating these communities. You are creating these highways now that you have to build to commute these white people that you just sent out into the suburbs back into the city, which is then destroying more communities. Um, it's a lot to process, you know what I
It's a
mean? It's
lot.
really,
It's a lot. You've covered a
yeah. I
lot of
mean,
it.
I
I
think
think
too,
you've
like,
gotten to the crux of it, but I think
mhm.
that you're getting ready to help us wind it down because there's a lot of it to touch on. But the basic statement is what, RK?
um,
For generational wealth. Why we're not able to build generational wealth.
okay, so homes, right? Home property, moving homes throughout generations, right? That is the biggest thing that you could do. Effectively, the government gave white people a 40-year head start.
Right.
Couple that with economic crisis in the 70s. Couple that with increased policing with the war on drugs and the crack epidemic. Um, Add the war on crime with that. Add the tough on crime epidemic in the early 90s. Um, when did we have time?
Yeah, these are all
And
hindering
that,
factors for sure.
and with us only still being around 13 to 14% of the population, not only do you not have a chance to grow economically, I mean, you can't really even build a family that you can support at that point. You know what I mean? Literally,
Right.
crisis after crisis hit us with no inherent wealth, passed down. Um, this is literally why there is such a strong disparity in between Black home ownership, which is like the biggest way that you can transfer wealth, obviously generationally. But then also the wealth gap as well too. I want to say Black home ownership right now is around like 41%, compared to like white families at 72% or so.
Right.
And the income gap in between, like I was saying earlier, that 140% income gap only went up to about 67% in the 70s. It's only at around like 35% now. And so there's still such a hard sell we have to go. I want to say the rate at Black inherited wealth to white families is every $5 a white family has 1,000. You know,
Right.
and so it's really difficult to get ahead when you're living paycheck to paycheck. You have no inherited wealth. Nothing is passed down to you. You're prematurely killed by the police. There's so many different economical and social economic factors that play into why we cannot continue to pass that on to people in our
Right.
families and stuff like that.
It's absolutely hard to catch up. You're absolutely right. And I want to transition into what's happening in Atlanta because everyone wants to know that. I want to thank everyone for joining us here on the Sedalia Njai show with our special guest, R.K. Jackson, who's been dropping a lot of gems about Atlanta history and about how systemic racism has played a part in that history and a geographical history of Atlanta. And why we can't perhaps even acquire generational wealth, and how kind of some of the most prominent historic districts in Atlanta have been run down or maybe even now gentrified, uh, as a consequence of everything that's been happening. So I want to kind of talk about. I've seen a lot of things on the news, and I know
Yeah,
everyone has, and I really want you to help us éclairer, put some light and shed some light on some of those things that's been happening, because I don't trust the news anymore. I do, but I don't.
that's fair.
I automatically go to it because I don't have any other outlets. But now that I do have other outlets, talented and knowledgeable people like yourself who are in my circle, I want to reach out and get their perspective and their knowledge about what's really going on. How are you really feeling in Atlanta? I know, how do you feel like the city of Atlanta has been handling the issue of police brutality and the consequential protests that have been happening?
Yeah, I find that Atlanta does a really good job with handling demonstrations and protests. Protests, I think, are in the fiber of Atlanta. Stemming from the civil rights movement. Stemming from voting rights movement in the 30s as well too, amongst the AUC students. So I do feel like it is always supported and the community is always involved. However, I feel like when you are trying to handle a global health epidemic and crisis, that is disproportionately affecting Black and Brown people and their communities, alongside trying to protest police brutality, which disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities, which are normally, you know, also poor. Those things are mutually exclusive normally in these communities. Um, it gets difficult because you've got, effectively a city full of all Black leadership who have effectively kind of been the old guard. They have had their status passed down to them, even if they weren't, completely a, political savant throughout their entire career. They were appointed by one or, were endorsed by one that probably saw some of themselves in what they were going to be able to do as leaders. And I feel like the great thing about that is you've got great Black leaders, but there's still a systemic problem that affects Black people. So a lot of times I find in spaces like that, these leaders they have a difficult time trying to lead and keep a lot of people safe and support the people and what their needs are and listen to the people. And then in direct correlation as well to try to uphold the structure of white supremacy itself. It is as embedded in capitalism you know, as it can be. You know, that's what this whole country was built upon. So I find that
Yeah.
what we see is there's a difficult power struggle there where you see Black leaders want to lead these movements, you know, in the city, but they have a lot of, you know, constitutional hangups and political hangups in policy and legislation. And so it's difficult because a lot of these politicians may be in the beginning of their career or towards the end of their career, and a lot of these things become political in nature itself. So it's being handled. I will say that we talked about this as well too. There have been a couple issues with the protests that directly created new protests, which is ironic again.
It's a lie. It's a whirlwind. But
Yeah,
you know, the point is that
yeah. I guess I can explain the beginning and try to get through that as much as I possibly can.
yeah.
Um, But basically, the global outcry of the George Floyd protests made themselves down to Atlanta, of course, obviously, and Breonna Taylor
Yes.
as well. And so those marches began and protests happened. But you can tell the energy is different. You know what I mean? The energy is definitely way different than what it was probably since the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, which is, I think, 7 years old, you know, this year as well, too. And so I find that uh, disproportionate police force during political protests, if you will. Well, I think this is a civil and human rights issue versus it being a political issue, but politics are directly correlated with that as well too. But that's a whole other story. I think that there is, with that disproportionate force and kind of not political, militarization of police during these protests kind of turns these peaceful things into something a lot more violent. And so I
Mm.
find that when you are, you know, you're tear gassing protesters and you are flash banging them and then you're literally closing them off of cities. I remember watching New York, they cornered them on a bridge. They closed both ends of the bridge, and they were literally going back and forth on the bridge um, right before that whole national curfew thing went into place. And because they were all out after curfew, that ended up in mass arrest, effectively. So now they're arresting people, you know, in Atlanta, in New York, in Portland, in Seattle, all over the country in mass, in just trying to protest, you know, being able to survive a traffic stop or being able to survive, you know, going to the corner store with, you know, to buy something, right? Um, and so one of the nights, I think the second or third night of the protest, was a really, really big issue where the curfew went into effect. And the curfew went into effect probably about 30 minutes or 40 minutes before um, police like immediately started to kind of crack down on people. But the protests have been going on for so long, a lot of people did not have the opportunity to realize that there was a curfew put in place. And so they were kind of stuck in traffic. They were in between places. They were still out on the street. They were going through the cars, you know, all these different things. And so the specific story that led to a lot of the original uprising in Atlanta was those two AUC students.
Before you get into
Uh-huh.
that ADC conversation, RK, we've talked a lot. We've touched on a lot, and this is what I want. This is what's so important, ladies and gentlemen. We're here to get an exclusive, to get the 411 basically on what is happening, because I don't believe that you should just listen to what's happening in the news. We already know that there's a history of bias and
Right.
politics that are involved. But unfortunately, our hour is up again, and this is really untraditional for the Sedalia and Jai show, ladies and gentlemen, that we're on here so long. But I really want this to be a special. This is a special, basically dedicated to us understanding what's happening so that we can move forward in a healthy way. So unfortunately, I have to cut out the live again just to bring you back, to not interrupt you in mid thought and mid conversation, because that's not a good thing to do. But I really encourage you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us. Please come right back We're not going to be here much longer. We're going to be here for about maybe another 20 to 30 minutes more at the maximum. And the last part of this conversation is really for you guys to get an in-depth view, an in-depth account of what is happening in Atlanta. Okay, because this is my trusted source. So I know you guys trust me. So you will be here and you can trust that. All right. Okay, we'll be right back.